In 1968, a British official wrote in a formal government document that the people living on an island in the Indian Ocean were a few Tarzans and Man Fridays. Whew, that document is still in the National Archives in Kew. I've seen it. Within 5 years, every one of those people was gone. There was no prosecution, no public reckoning, no visible institutional penalty. Because legally, according to the paperwork constructed before they were removed, they had never been permanent residents at all. Their island is now one of the most heavily restricted military installations on Earth. Diego Garcia, a joint United States and United Kingdom base. Access is tightly controlled. There is no permanent civilian population. There is no routine independent civilian oversight. And the people who lived there for generations? Many ended up in poverty in the slums of Mauritius and the Seychelles, with compensation they themselves described as humiliating, and with a legal status that made return impossible. The British government called them contract workers. The courts called that a fiction. I've been reading the court documents for weeks, and the further I go, the harder it is to look away. The official name for the archipelago is the British Indian Ocean Territory, BIOT. It was created on November 8, 1965, specifically detached from Mauritius before Mauritius gained independence. The British government paid Mauritius £3 million to give up its claim to the islands. And here is where the story becomes dangerous, because the strategic logic can be real, and the human cost can be deliberately hidden at the same time. Diego Garcia sits almost exactly in the center of the Indian Ocean, equidistant from Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. For a military planner in 1966, it was irreplaceable. You couldn't buy that geography. You could only rent it. The deal gave the U.S. its base and Britain its nuclear submarines. The documents called it a sweetheart arrangement. I want to be precise here. The strategic argument was real. The Cold War was not a fiction. But a genuine military interest does not explain what had to happen to the people before that base could be built. The most powerful weapon in this story is not a bomb. It is a definition. Because the question was never whether the base was justified. The question was what had to happen to the people before the base could be built. And the answer in the files is this. First, you redefine them. British administrators did not describe removing a population. They described maintaining the fiction that Diego Garcia had no permanent population to begin with. That phrase, maintaining the fiction, appears in a 1966 Foreign Office file. Reference FO 371/184528. Not a conspiracy theory, a file reference. And that fiction was not a side effect of the military agreement. It was the precondition. The agreement required the people to have never existed. So a legal framework was built, retroactively, to make them disappear on paper before they were removed in person. The people of the Chagos archipelago had been living on these islands since the late 18th century, primarily descendants of enslaved Africans and Indian laborers brought by French colonists. By the 1960s, they were a settled community. They fished, they farmed copra. They had a church, a hospital, a school, a cemetery. The islands were home. Their name for themselves was Chagossians, or by their own word, Îlois, the people of the islands. In 1971, the British government passed the Immigration Ordinance for BIOT. It was a formulation of exceptional harshness, even by the standards of late colonial administration. No person shall be permitted to enter the territory as a worker or otherwise, except as required by the government of the territory. No one was permitted to enter. which, on the ground, meant no one was permitted to remain. Here is the moment where the story stops being geopolitics and becomes a disappearing act. Under international law, there is a difference between a home and a job. A settled population has rights. Contract workers do not. The British government understood this perfectly. So before the deportations began, they rewrote the question. The question stopped being, how do we remove a people, and became, how do we confirm there was never a people to remove? A stroke of a pen. And between 1,500 and 2,000 people became, on paper, a terminated workforce. The removal happened in stages from the late 1960s through 1973, and the mechanism was ordinary bureaucratic pressure. Food and medicine imports to the outer islands were cut. Petrol was stopped. Boats stopped arriving. A Department of Defense document from 1970 describes the strategy as making the islands uninhabitable. A man named Louis Olivier Bancoul was 2 years old when his family was told they needed to leave for medical treatment on Mauritius. His mother, Rita Bancoul, was told she could return when her daughter recovered. She never got that return passage. They arrived in Port Louis and were left there. No resettlement plan, no support, no structure waiting for them. They had come from a place where every path, every grave, every family name meant something. They arrived in a city that treated them as surplus. Louis's father stopped eating. The family said he died of a broken heart. That is their phrase, not mine. Rita Bancoul stopped telling stories about Diego Garcia. She stopped singing the songs she used to sing in Creole on the veranda. Louis Bancoul said, "They took everything from us. Our land, our history, our right to say we existed there." He spent 30 years in court trying to get back. The animals were removed first. British administrators organized the killing of the islanders' pets and livestock before the final deportations. The dogs were gassed. The administrator at the time described this as necessary to avoid disease risk. A Chagossian woman named Lisette Talat was present. She described the scene in testimony before the European Court of Human Rights. She said, "They burnt the dogs in front of us. They said our cats and dogs were full of diseases. Then they told us our turn would come, that we were animals, the same as the dogs." Lisette Talat died in 2012 in a slum in Mauritius. She never returned to Diego Garcia. The last deportation ships left in 1973. In 2000, the British High Court ruled that the removal was unlawful. The Chagossians had a right of abode on the outer islands. The court ordered the right of return to be restored. For the first time in 27 years, a British judge said what the Chagossians had been saying all along. They were a people. They had a home, and they had been taken from it illegally. Louis Bancoul received the phone call in his apartment in Port Louis. He wept. His neighbors, other Chagossians packed into the same housing blocks, came out into the corridor. Some of them had been children on the last boats out in 1973. They were in their 30s now. They had grown up hearing about an island they could not visit. And suddenly, a court in London had told them they could go back. They did not go back. The Blair government responded by bypassing Parliament. They used an order in council, an archaic royal prerogative, a mechanism that hadn't been invoked for this purpose in living memory, to rewrite immigration law. In 2004, without debate, without vote, in a single signed document. The right of return was canceled by executive order. When the courts challenged that, too, the government argued national security. In 2008, the House of Lords, the highest court in Britain at the time, upheld the order. The records were not sealed. Unlike the adoption files I found in the orphan trains case, everything here is technically public. But the outcome is the same. Legal, technically, permanently. The most terrifying thing in this story is not the deportation. It is the vocabulary that made it possible. Watch how the sequence works. First, the islands are detached from Mauritius. Then the military agreement is signed. Then the fiction appears in the files. Then the islands are made unlivable. Then the people are removed. Then the courts admit it was unlawful. Then the government changes the law again. In 2019, the International Court of Justice declared the UK's administration of Chagos illegal. Advisory opinion, non-binding. In 2025, the UK and Mauritius signed an agreement recognizing Mauritian sovereignty over the Chagos archipelago, including Diego Garcia, while preserving a long-term UK role over the base itself. Chagossian groups said their voices were not meaningfully included. Îlois is still alive. He is still in Mauritius. The agreement preserved the base. It did not restore the homes. Every correction comes after the damage, and every legal shift leaves the Chagossians further from home. After 2008, the Chagossians had no legal instruments left, only one place they could ask to be let into. Not home, just the graves. There is one detail I keep returning to. The island of Diego Garcia has a cemetery. The descendants of the people buried there are not allowed to visit it. Not for funerals, not for maintenance, not to lay flowers. The British and American governments have allowed supervised humanitarian visits twice. The first was in 2006, the second in 2016. Organized, controlled, timed. The Chagossians arrived by ship. They were escorted to the cemetery under military supervision. They pulled weeds from the graves. They poured water on the stones. Some of them knelt and whispered to people who had been dead for decades. Parents, grandparents, aunts who had died in Mauritius and whose remains had been brought back years before. The visit lasted 48 hours, not a day more. Then they were put back on the ship. By that point, they were no longer asking to return to normal life. They were asking for access to proof. Not to houses, not to land, not even to politics. To graves. In one of the official British documents from that visit, there is a photograph caption. It describes the Chagossians in the cemetery as former inhabitants. Former. Not people. Not residents. Not descendants. Former inhabitants of a place they were born. A place their grandparents died. A place whose stones they cleaned with their own hands for 48 hours before being sent away again. Every fact I've described today is in the public record. The Foreign Office files are at Kew. The court judgments are online. You can look them up this afternoon. And yet most people have never heard of Diego Garcia. The silence around this story is not the result of secrecy. It is the result of a world that looked at 2,000 people on a small island and decided they did not need to be explained. The mechanism changes. The pattern does not. First, the people are reclassified. Then access to proof is controlled. Then time does the rest. They were not erased because the records were hidden. They were erased because the records were written that way in the first place. If you have a family connection to the Chagos Islands, if you knew someone who was there, or if you are a descendant, I want to hear from you in the comments. The Welsh knot case, which we'll cover next, starts from a different mechanism. Not an island, not a deportation, but a wooden board hung around a child's neck. The goal is the same. The pattern continues. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.